Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I am so excited to be here today with Richard Langlois, who is the author of The Corporation and the 20th Century, The History of American Business Enterprise. And I can't recommend this book enough. I've been reading it for the past month. It is a commitment. This is 550 pages plus 150 pages of notes. This is a masterpiece, and I'm so excited to speak with the author. Dick, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be invited.
So let me start with saying something that is probably partly wrong, but
Ah,
simplified, and I'm going to ask you to correct my understanding. So the kind of broad brush strokes, Alfred Chandler won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1977 for The Visible Hand, the Managerial Revolution in American Business. And the main argument of that book, if I understand it correctly, is that, we had this transition from entrepreneur-led businesses like Rockefeller's, Standard Oil, to the modern multi-unit business with its, multi-divisional administrative, run by managers and not necessarily by owners. And as I understood it, his main argument was that the multi-unit business enterprise with internal administrative managerial coordination was better able to coordinate resources than the market. And that's why we have these big corporations. But your book, kind of broad brush, and I want you to correct me or get more precise. My takeaway is that, well, that might be partly true, but actually what largely drove this transformation is number one, antitrust, which had all these unintended consequences. Antitrust because it said, you couldn't have restraint of trade. It made coordination out between firms, in many cases illegal, but you could do similar sorts of coordination within the firm. So corporations responded by acquiring either competitors or vertically integrating. That was a big driver that I took away. And then additionally, other things impacted it, like the Depression wiping out so many financial institutions, made it the case that internal capital markets were able to function and fund innovation, whereas the external finance opportunities to fund were largely, in many cases, like obliterated, not available to smaller businesses. And then a third factor that I took from the book was that price controls and government interference with markets kind of just interfered with market mechanisms, so it made it difficult for smaller businesses, but larger businesses could coordinate resources. So those were three things. But I'd like
yeah.
you to tell the story and
Well,
expand it for me.
I think you have it exactly right. I mean, the book functions at a couple of levels. At one level, it's an economic history of the corporation in the 20th century. But as you say, I have, in addition, this kind of running argument at a number of levels. It's kind of a conversation with Alfred Chandler. He, coming out of what I describe as kind of a progressive tradition in the early 20th century, thinking that scientific management has arrived, and now scientific management is really a substitute for the market, and we can create these large vertically integrated corporations, or they arose, these large vertically integrated, and that's part of the story too. Is that I'm talking about here about vertical integration, why one company will do lots of different things instead of being specialized. So you can have large companies that are large, have a high market cap or something, but are very specialized in one thing and contract for a lot of other things. Or you can have the kind of companies we saw a lot in the middle of the 20th century, which did all kinds of different things and made all their own parts and right, and did lots of things like that. So Chandler argues that, well, in the 19th century, it was all small businesses. Uh, things were coordinated by the price mechanism, but with the rise of the railroad, the coming of coal as a power source, you saw the rise of the large company, and in order to manage the far-flung enterprises with high economies of scale, you necessarily had to have um, management. You had to have conscious management of the corporation with professional managers who weren't also owners. And my argument is to push back a little bit, as you're saying on that, just to say that we have to look at what was going on in history at this time. And I agree. And basically, the kind of theoretical structure of the argument is transactions in a market require institutions. They require market supporting institutions of various kinds, financial markets, legal systems, things of that sort. And you can provide those in the larger economy in a decentralized way. But if those institutions don't work very well for various reasons, the large firm is in a sense a substitute source of institutions. And that's one way to think about this whole argument. So you can create institutions in a decentralized way in markets, if you want to call them that, or you can, if markets don't work very well, you can create those institutions inside of the firm. And so my argument is, why did we see the era of the large managerial firm? Well, in part, Chandler is right about coordination, but also a lot of it was, if you step back, you see that markets weren't working very well for some of the reasons you enumerated. I put a lot of emphasis on the Great Depression, which really was a catastrophe, and it destroyed market supporting institutions and affected and what we sort of like a Darwinian effect. A lot of small enterprises went away, and what was left were the large firms. The New Deal and the Second World War reemphasized this, because the New Deal put controls on market institutions. The Second World War had to utilize the large corporations to make stuff for the war. And so that whole middle part of the century, right, you saw markets not working very well. And so the part of what we see in the great success of the large vertically integrated corporation is the lack of success of the alternatives to the large vertically integrated corporation. And antitrust comes into this as well, and that's one of the themes that runs through this. You see this especially, I think, after World War II, which was a period of very intense antitrust scrutiny. There was a period, Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. It was an early period of intense antitrust. And then you got another period of intense antitrust after the war. And that was, I think, important for the reasons that you said. It made it difficult to engage in contracting in the market, because those contracts, especially if they looked complex and hard to understand, these contracts would come under antitrust scrutiny, and it was just a lot easier for firms to do things internally when nobody could see them, if you will, yeah. Right? And so that is part of the argument.
Let's get into some examples of these contracts that at the time were hard to understand. There's several places in the book where you talk about a type of form of contract, and where you say, later in the century, economists would come to understand that this actually makes a ton of sense or see the reasons for it.
Right.
So one that you gave, which I thought was fascinating, was around how movie studios would sell entire blocks of movies and to the cinemas, and the cinemas would would sort of agree to, I'll just show the next 10 films that you produce, whatever they are. Right. I don't get to look at them first. And that was declared illegal. Tell us about that one a little bit, and then maybe give some other examples of forms of contract, like retail price maintenance, that were deemed illegal at one point.
Sure. I mean, block booking is one of the most fascinating episodes, and economists are still kind of arguing about that. There are lots of different theories, but the basic argument is that movies today, as back then, are shots in the dark, right? So you make this, you have to spend a lot of money up front to make a movie, but you don't know how it's going to be received, right? So it could be a hit, or it could be a total failure, and we see this today, right? With studios hedging their bet, trying to make movies that they're almost sure people are going to want, but they still get it wrong, right? So what do the movie studios have to do? They have to hedge their bets in some way. So how do they do that? Well, they do that the way we do in finance all the time. You don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? So they would make a bunch of movies and they would pre-sell them to the distributors. They would also own some movie theaters so that they could have a good sense of what was working and what was not working, right? And they would pre-sell these to the distributors and they would say, look, you've got to show all of them. So that's going to reduce our risk because we know you're going to have to show all of them. Some of them will be successes and some of them will be failures. But on average, right, they'll do well, and so we can smooth our portfolio in the way finance teaches us. But of course, the theaters said the theaters could tell right away which ones were going to be, from people showing up, which ones are going to be good and which ones are going to be bad, and they didn't want to pay for the bad ones, right? They wanted to keep only the good ones and not pay for the bad ones, and so they raised a lot of fuss about this. And the antitrust authorities looked at this and they said, "Oh my God, this is a strange contract. This must be anti-competitive. They're restricting you from competing because and so the courts actually broke up the thing that turned out actually to be most significant was um, not allowing theaters to own distributors and distributors to own movie theaters, and that actually destroyed the old studio system and gave us the system that we had today. But they also required for some periods that studios not sell as a block. They had to sell each movie individually, which of course raised the risk and uncertainty to them. So that's fascinating to me. Um, Another one that's actually maybe more relevant today we could think about is and was really, I think, formative in among economists in thinking about these contracts was the so-called leverage theory. So intuitively, you might think if I'm making a product that requires two complementary things, so like a classic case was in the 1930s when IBM was still making mechanical computing equipment
Hmm.
before computers. They relied on punch cards. Punch cards went back to Herman Hollerith in the 19th century, which was a part of the beginning of what became IBM. So they would have these computing machines and they would also have the cards. And IBM would say, you have to buy the cards from us. You can't buy the cards from anybody else, right? And why would they want, so why does IBM care, right? They're making these complicated machines. Why do they care about little pieces of cardboard to sell you? And economists thought about that, and they said, well, there's two reasons they want to do this, right? One is quality control, because if you buy crummy cards from somebody else, it's going to wreck their machines and you'll blame them. The other reason is price discrimination, right? Price discrimination means we charge a high price to people who really, really want this, and we'll charge a low price to people who don't want it so much, and that actually makes more money for us. It's actually efficient, economically efficient to do that. Right? Because if we sell you a punch card machine, we can't tell if you are a big demander of of this service of computing or a light demander. But by selling you the cards, we can tell how many cards you buy, right? And we can put more of the price onto the cards. And so the big demanders pay more than the low demanders, right? So there's all these complicated reasons why they would do this. But the antitrust authority said this is terrible. This is an anti-competitive practice. But of course, it makes no sense because they said, well, what's happening is the big company's trying to leverage its monopoly from one. It's got a monopoly in or market power anyway, right? In computing equipment because it's better than anybody else in making computer equipment. So it's got some market power in computer equipment, and it's trying to take over the punch card industry. And it turns out this is silly from an economic point of view, right? Because what are you selling? You are selling computing services, and computing services consists of both the machine and the cards. And so you can shift the price around between the two, but there's only one optimal price to charge for that service, right? You can't make that any bigger. I mean, this came to be called the so-called one lump of monopoly theory, right? You can't make your monopoly any bigger by tying it to something else, because what you're doing is actually raising the total price of the whole service above what the best price is for you. And
Yeah.
that's sort of relevant today because a lot of issues are arising with people like Amazon and Google and Apple and so on about so-called self-preferencing, right? And this is a version of the same thing, right? Where you're effectively tying your version of some component to your main thing that you're selling. And economists say, look, this is really just this is tying in another guise, that you're just kind of moving the price around between these two things, but you're not really making your monopoly any bigger by um, by self by self preferencing. Right?
Yeah, it was basically almost the Amazon Web Services of the day. They were really selling kind of usage of the machines. Um,
Correct.
so another related one, which about IBM, which I thought was fascinating, was that IBM was leasing their machines and instead of just selling the machines,
Yes.
which had several implications. One is that their salespeople were actually perfectly happy to kind of sell into computers to replace the mechanical machines because
Correct.
it wasn't going to cannibalize their sales. It was going to, just replace one lease with another. But then the federal government made those leases illegal, I think. So to tell us a little bit about that, like why was the
Well,
federal government like opposing leases?
um, I mean, that's sort of a good question. I mean, the leasing goes way back, right? So this really started in the first industrial revolution, where the companies that made looms. So in Britain, less so in the U.S., but in Britain, the textile industry was highly vertically disintegrated. It looked like a 21st century industrial district, right? Everybody owned little firms and you could buy everything on the market. So if you wanted to start a cloth making firm, you could rent the equipment from Platt Brothers of Oldham, who made the equipment, and you would just pay by the month or whatever, or by the amount of cloth you made or something. And so that lowers the upfront fixed costs for entrepreneurs. So this was something that happened throughout the 19th century into the 20th. United Shoe Machinery was another case that's very similar. United Shoe Machinery was a big company in Beverly, Massachusetts that made all the shoemaking equipment. And if you wanted to get into the shoe business, you had an idea for a new kind of shoe, you could just rent your capital equipment from United Shoe Machinery, and they would set everything up for you. They'd tell you which machines you needed. They would charge you by how many shoes you made or something like that, not charge you for not charge you for, you wouldn't own the equipment. You would just lease it from them and they would continue to own it. And this kind of spurred, again, small entrepreneurial sector who could easily get into the business. And the same was true with IBM. So they would lease their in the days of giant mainframe computers, they would lease that. And by the federal government in this case, it was really antitrust policy. So there were lawsuits there was a lawsuit against United Shoe Machinery. There was a lawsuit against IBM, and they told them that they couldn't lease these machines. They had to sell them, and why it's not entirely clear, right? And a lot of it in all these cases has to do with competitors, right? If you are somebody who's also trying to get into the computer business, or somebody, there were a lot of smaller and less successful mainframe computer companies. There were a few smaller and less successful shoe machinery companies, and they saw the success of the larger companies by leasing, making it hard for them to get into business, right? If you had to sell say, the shoemaking machinery, for example, you had to sell it. Well, then maybe I don't have to buy all of it from United Shoe Machinery. I could buy it from some of these other people. And in fact, what this is part of the issue is that what United would do, it would make it hard for you to buy from these other people, because what the shoemakers would do is they would start out leasing the stuff from United Shoe Machinery, who would show them how to do everything, would set up the whole enterprise for them, teach them how it worked. And once they knew all that, then they would want to get rid of their leases, and they would want to go buy the cheaper equipment from the other guys who were in the industry. And that would kind of make the whole system collapse. So United would say, look, if you're going to buy from us and get all this knowledge and information bundled with our machines, then we're going to make sure that you have long leases, and you can't just stop leasing from us and go buy the cheap stuff, free ride on free ride on the knowledge we gave you. And in fact, a lot of these complex contracting are all about free riding. They're all about kind of stopping free riding. You mentioned resale price maintenance. That's another that's another example. If I'm going on too long here, stop me.
No, this is great. This is great.
Resale price maintenance is where the manufacturers tells the retailer what price they have to sell, and so that looks anti-competitive, right? Because the retailers can't compete on price. But what the manufacturer wants to do is they don't want the retailers to compete on price. They want them to compete on quality and service and repairs and service and stuff like that. So I mean, if you think about some product, especially a product that's fairly new. I was just reading a paper about vacuum cleaners and washing machines in the early 20th century that would sort of work like this. People didn't really, in refrigerators, people really didn't know about these things, right? These were unknown products, and they were very complicated products that needed a lot of service in the early days. And so what the companies would do is they would say, you have to charge this price for these machines, and you have to provide service and sales and really hard salesmanship, and you have to just do the servicing for people and all of that kind of stuff, because they didn't want people to go to, and this is maybe something we experience in our own lives. You could go to the full service showroom, right, and ask them all these questions about the product, right? Spend a lot of the salesman's time finding out about this product and which one is the best for you and how it works and so on. And then you go online and buy the cheap one.
Yeah, I
right?
mean, there's even a term for that,
Right.
showrooming, right?
Right, exactly. And so resale price maintenance was to stop showrooming, basically, right? To make sure that people couldn't free ride on the people who were doing what they were supposed to be doing and offering all of those services. And again, the antitrust people say, well, this is anti-competitive because you're not allowing the resellers to compete on price. I think part of it. So why did they do this? I think it's a very interesting question. I think it's partly intellectual, right? It's partly sort of partly kind of an anti, thinking that businesses are being generally have a tendency to be anti-competitive. And part of it is having this kind of naive model about how markets work, and part of it is the interests of consumers, right? So there were a lot of cut rate sellers who didn't like this, who wanted to get into the business by free riding, right? And so they would put pressure on the antitrust authorities to stop this so that they could get into this market and use a price strategy instead of a quality strategy.
What effect, if any, have you detected in all of your research on the impact of ideas and management technology, if you will, not technology in terms of computers, but just management techniques, KPIs, roles, authorities, org charts, the BCG matrix of cash cows and stars and dogs and stuff. Like,
Yeah,
to
yeah,
what
yeah,
degree
yeah,
did
yeah.
just ideas about how to manage a company did how to what extent did that affect the evolution of business? Is management consultants and the ideas industry more of just a after effect of observing what's already happening, or did in some cases actually drive change?
Well, I mean, I don't talk that much about management consulting in the book, because as you point out, it's already too long. There's a lot of other things I could have talked about. I mean, when I talk about I talk about scientific management in kind of a not so much a negative way, as I think it has been misunderstood. And I think management consultants who are listening to this will probably understand this, right? That it's not a magic bullet, right? So it's not that we become experts and we know how to manage all of these things. It's that we're sort of learning from how things are actually done. We're kind of learning better ways to do things, right? And that was true of the going back to the scientific management of Frederick Winslow Taylor and all of these guys in the early 20th century. It's not that they had some, they kind of portrayed it as if they had some special knowledge, but what was really going on is, they were working. Taylor was working at Midvale Steel and learning, trying and slowly, kind of by trial and error, discovering better ways to do things, right? And I think that's the right way to think about it. That scientific management consulting is about learning through trial and error, learning better ways to do things. We'll come up with new theories, right? The BCG matrix was very important in the, I talk about the period of the conglomerates and the breaking up of the conglomerates, and that was, contemporaneous with that set of theories, right? So which divisions do we buy? Which ones do we invest in? Which ones do we keep? Right, the Jack Welch, GE kind of stuff. That was important. That was important in its day. But as I talk about in the book, that was kind of an episode um, that happened in the breakup and deregulation of these large firms. I don't think that was that the ideas were driving this. I mean, that's a big question, right? So how important are ideas? And I think to some extent this book is kind of leaning against the wind about ideas. I mean, there's a lot of books out there that talk about so-called neoliberalism and the neoliberalism of the late 20th century, and it was those ideas that broke up companies and so on. And my argument is that was not necessarily unimportant. And I think ideas are very important, for example, in antitrust policy. They've been important in antitrust throughout the history of antitrust. But I think a lot of it is being driven just by, and I don't, maybe I overemphasize this because I'm kind of leaning against the wind here, but a lot of it is driven by what profit opportunities there are out there in the world and what relative prices are. And my argument, towards the end of the book is that a lot of the reason the large corporation got torn apart into much more specialized corporations was in part that market supporting institutions had come back to life, right? So now capital markets were working again. External capital markets were now more effective than the internal capital markets of firms, and so they were taking firms apart. Regulations were impeding innovation in areas like right, like air freight and containerized shipping and telecommunications and so on. And so there were profit opportunities for entrepreneurs who could undo some of that stuff, right? Who could put pressure on Congress and the executive branch to try to undo some of the regulation of the mid-century that was making it hard for them to innovate.
I don't know enough about economic history to necessarily identify them. So I would like to ask you, What claims or arguments that you make in the book would be considered controversial by some of your peers in the profession?
Well, I think my view of antitrust would be controversial. I think there are a lot of people who would agree with me, but there would also be a lot of people who don't agree with me. I have, as you put it, I mean, I this is not really kind of just antitrust against antitrust for the sake of being against antitrust. I'm making a very specific argument, and kind of a neglected argument about what we should be careful about in the unintended consequences of antitrust, right? That if antitrust goes against complex contracts as anti-competitive, it's going to have the unintended consequence of of just making people want to hide those contracts inside the boundaries of the firm, and I think that's potentially potentially a controversial idea. And I think sort of the idea that um, the history of the corporation was really a story about institutional choice and some institutions being preferred over other institutions. I think that's kind of a controversial way of thinking about it. I mean, a lot of books that you will read, especially by um, historians of capitalism who aren't really economists, will be, books about neoliberalism, right? There's about a dozen books out there now about the rise of neoliberalism in the late 1900s, and why um, that was the cause of deregulation and so on. And I'm again kind of leaning against that wind too, and saying that most of the deregulation occurred um, before there was a lot of ideological change in Washington. It was really going on even from the end of World War II, right? Because it was pretty clear at the end of World War II we were getting back to a market economy, and a lot of the institutional structures that had been put up in the Depression and World War II were not appropriate to the market economy that we were getting into after World War II. And so there was a lot of realignment that was necessarily going to happen, quite independent of ideas, if you will.
Now, one area that I just don't have enough like direct exposure or intuition about, and I'd love it if you could help me understand it a bit better, is well, two things actually, like holding companies and the informed corporation. Maybe we talk about holding companies first. So, back in the early 20th century, holding companies were a big deal. You'd have a company owning other companies that own other companies, like Turtles all the way down. It'd be like multiple levels. And then like some stuff happened, and that became, I think, like illegal. And so like we don't really have holding companies anymore per se, although we do
Right.
now have private equity firms that own a bunch of companies, but maybe that's different.
Yes.
But tell me a little bit about like, because I don't really understand it since we don't have them today. What were holding companies like? Why did the government like outlaw them, and what do economists think about holding companies? They just help educate me a little bit there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a very good question, because that's kind of another big theme in the book, right? So, holding company is, in some sense, just what we think of as a corporation, and that really didn't sort of the modern corporation as we think of it, right? So, in a company where you can go to Delaware, fill out some papers, pay a little money, and you can become incorporated, and you become a legal person. You have limited liability. You have all these other legal features, right? That really didn't exist in the United States until 1899, roughly. Um, Before that, governments had to specifically license companies, and they limited what they could do, and right and so on. So by 1899, you get this unrestricted corporate form that we now think of. And one of the things that the unrestricted corporation could do is it as a legal person could buy the stock of some other company, right? And this is actually how most of the world today is organized. The U.S. is really an outlier in this. So if you look at industrial organization, especially in developing countries, but even in some highly developed countries like Canada or Sweden or Israel, what you find are business groups, right? So there's a family at the top. It's often a family or a foundation that was created by a family long ago that is the kind of apex of the pyramid, and then that company owns some other companies, and but they don't completely own them. So they're not unlike in the U.S. So in the U.S. you've got a company that has divisions, but those divisions are typically wholly owned subsidiaries, right? There are no minority stockholders. Whereas around the world, you have these business groups where the apex company will own controlling shares in a bunch of companies, but not all the shares.
Mm.
And then those companies in turn will own controlling shares in some other companies, but not all the shares, right? So it's a giant pyramid all the way down, and that didn't develop in the U.S. because of public policy, right? Because people almost immediately, and it's still I think widely believed in a lot of populist circles on both sides of the political spectrum, actually, that there's just something inherently wrong with allowing one company to own the stock of another company, and this was widely felt in the early 20th century, and it was believed by people like Franklin Roosevelt and so they and Louis Brandeis and people like that, and it was basically through a variety of channels. It was outlawed in the U.S. Or made very difficult, right? We have taxation of intercorporate dividends in the U.S., which most places don't, right? If you're going to tax intercorporate dividends, if it's not a wholly owned subsidiary, you're going to make it hard for people to create these pyramidal business groups, right? And so that was another reason for why we see vertically integrated operating companies, is because they couldn't organize it in other ways, right? So other organizational forms were kind of precluded. With deregulation, you raise a very interesting question, a very interesting point about um, private equity, because with deregulation, there's in some ways we're kind of going back to some of the structures that we had earlier on, right? So you think about groups in the early 20th century, like the House of Morgan, JP Morgan. They were basically what they were private was private equity, right? So they would own controlling shares in a bunch of companies, and they would have elect directors and so on. And so that's not very different from KPG or something today, or I guess Berkshire Hathaway, but Berkshire Hathaway is a little bit of a right is a little bit of a unique example, right? Where the Berkshire Hathaway doesn't own all of companies. It owns controlling interests, and sometimes not even controlling interests, right? In a lot of companies. So that's a form that exists around the world and used to exist in the U.S., but really didn't exist in the middle of the 20th century for kind of public policy reasons.
So it's interesting. So they said, okay, you can own 100% of your subsidiary, but you're not allowed to own 65%.
Correct, right? Because what they were worried about, people like Burley and Means and Brandeis, they were worried about oppressing the minority stockholders, right? So if you're a majority stockholder and you own, so you think about these business groups where you have controlling interest in all these companies. Well, what if you move money around between these companies in ways that enriches you but harms the minority stockholders of the other of those companies, right? So minority stockholders was the problem. It turns out that they had to pay a price for this. That in fact that there was a that stockholders got a discount on their stock, and because of this threat, which typically didn't actually happen, but that's what they were worried about, right? So they were worried about the minority.
Okay.
They were worried about the minorities stockholders um, more than anything else, right? So,
Tell me about the
um,
Inform Corporation,
right, that was the other.
how did that differ
Sure,
from like previous types of
sure.
companies?
So in the end, so what is cool about the corporate form, right? What is cool about it is that it is kind of like a modular. It creates a kind of a module, right, where everything goes on inside the module is kind of hidden from the outside. And then the module itself, right? It's like the pieces of a personal computer, right? It can talk to other and buy maybe even buy the shares of other modules, but it doesn't necessarily it's not integrated with the operations of these other modules, right? And that's kind of the genius of the corporation. So if you think about the history of this idea of the corporation, and people have written about the history of the corporation going back to really ancient times, um, and why it was created. The Catholic Church had a lot to do with it in the West, right? It was a way to protect church assets from the state and so on.
What books do you
Uh,
like? There's on that. There's William Magnuson's book For Profit. What
I don't know that one.
there's We the Corporations. What other books on the history of the
Yeah,
corporation do you
yeah, yeah.
like?
A guy called an Israeli guy called Ron Harris has written a book on the in the same series as my book. Actually, has written a book on the history or the old history of corporations. Um, but the issue is modules, right? So these corporations were modules, and it's very complicated to integrate, right? So the vertically integrated company in the beginning, everything is connected to everything, right? So, and this was true, for example, with um, Standard Oil, for example, in the early days, that everything was connected to everything. You were on one executive would be on seven different committees, and right, so all the information is flowing all over the place, and that doesn't scale well, right? So whereas a modular system scales well, a non-modular system doesn't scale very well. So as these corporations got bigger, they started to say, well, we can't become holding companies anymore, but we need modularity. That is, we need to break up our operations into smaller pieces that don't are constant they're not constantly transmitting information, rich information to each other. And was the M form, right? So this is the brainchild of people like Alfred Sloan and Pierre Dupont. They were going to break the company up into pieces, but the pieces would be wholly owned subsidiaries rather than holding companies. So you can think of the M form as kind of was in a way the kind of wholly owned version of the holding company, right? So for example, Chevrolet was a module in General Motors, and Buick was a module, and Cadillac was a module, right? And these were divisions that were wholly owned by General Motors. You couldn't buy shares in Chevrolet; you had to buy shares in General Motors, right? But within General Motors, Chevrolet was a module, like sort of like its own company, right? And so later on, during the conglomerate era, people could just buy these divisions from one another because they were modules, right? They were like holding companies. They were wholly owned holding companies, but we could just buy them from one another, right? So ITT bought a hotel chain, and they bought a bakery company, and they bought insurance companies, right? Things that are completely unrelated to their business because they're just modules. We're going to buy them, and we're going to put them underneath the head office. So they're very similar. So a holding company and an M form division really very similar. The main difference was, in one case, they operated through the interface of the market. In the other case, they operated through the corporate hierarchy.
I would like to read more biographies, particularly biographies of some business executives, innovators, business professionals. I've read the Robert Caro biographies of Lyndon Johnson and Robert Moses,
Mm.
of course, and those are amazing. Are there, with all your reading and research for this, are there biographies that you would recommend of any characters? Like, as I was going through the book, I started making a list of people
Yeah.
I'd like to learn more about, like Herbert Hoover, Vannevar Bush, Alfred Sloan, Grace Hopper, Bernard Baruch. Are there any particular biographies that you think really illustrate not just the person but also the time that you think that you'd add to a list?
Yeah, I mean, there's all the there's of course all the Ron Chernow biographies, right? So he did he did Rockefeller and Morgan, so those would be good places to to start. And there are biographies of all these of all these people. There's a lot of biographies of Hoover. There's actually some um, you know revisionist ones that that uh, I think that are much more. I would have to look for the names. Um, one author that I would very much recommend is Mark Levinson. He did a wonderful book about A&P, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, and a great book about the container. I mean, he like the definitive book about
The box. The box,
containerized
right?
shipping. Yeah, I mean those are great books that I would recommend to anybody.
I was one of those students that did very well in microeconomics in college and business school. It almost seemed intuitive, but I really struggled with macroeconomics. I was one of those students that was like very bimodal, it
Yeah,
was
yeah,
like
yeah,
super sailed through on micro, like, but really struggled with getting my head around macro stuff. So I've
yeah.
always had a hard time with these arguments around like the gold standard and the silver standard. And then your argument that the depression, like we largely came out of it, not through fiscal policy, but through monetary policy
Right.
in just 2 minutes because it's such a simple topic. Could you explain like the gold standard versus silver standard argument that was going on with the election of McKinley and what
Sure.
was why were they fighting about that, right?
Sure. That I mean that's really interesting stuff. So we no longer have a monetary metal standard. We have what's called fiat money, meaning the government can just determine what the money is. So the Federal Reserve just creates money out of thin air. But but back in the day, in principle, and for a while, in fact, the monetary standard was tied to gold, right? In the U.S. And that was a conscious decision by some interests, or right, the business interests especially wanted, especially the ones involved in international trade, wanted the U.S. to be on the gold standard so that our currency would be taken seriously by other countries like Britain, because it's the same as their currency, basically, right? Everything's gold, and dollars are exchangeable for gold, and that's right, and that's fine. But what the U.S. did in the 19th century, well into the 20th century, is they imposed tariffs to protect the manufacturing interests, which was really effectively a tax on our exporters. And so, who are our exporters? Our exporters tended to be farmers exporting wheat and cotton and raw materials and things like that. And so the people who were importers and financiers, they wanted a strong dollar. So that's why they wanted it connected to gold. The people who were exporting wanted a weak dollar because they wanted their goods to look cheap to people in other countries, so other countries would buy them. Right. So it's pretty straightforward, right? That exporters generally want a weak currency and importers want a strong currency that was, and that's true in has been true in a lot of developing tiger countries and whatever, that they've tried to keep their currency cheap so that foreigners would buy their stuff. And so because we're on the gold standard, this really angered. I mean, this was a big thing in the 19th century, right? There's a famous claim that the movie the Wizard of Oz is all about this. right? That Oz was the yellow brick road was the gold standard, and the scarecrow represented the farmers, right, and the tin man represented the industrial worker and all this kind of stuff. And what did these people want? They wanted to get rid of the gold standard, and they wanted to go to a mixed standard with silver. Why is that? Well, because that's inflation, right? So if you can tie the money to other stuff, you've got more money, and so the value of the dollar falls. The more dollars there are, right, the less valuable every dollar is. So the currency is cheaper, and people are going to buy our stuff abroad. So the people in the West who were exporters were supporters of free silver, and the people in the East who were financiers dealing with the British and importers wanted to have a strong dollar, and that was a lot of the political economy of the 19th century. And in fact, I argue that the Sherman Antitrust Act actually was part of that whole episode. Um, you know, but yeah, that monetary macro was a lot simpler in the days when there was um, uh, a fixed metallic standard. That stopped happening really with World War One. And after World War One, the U.S. was technically on the gold standard, but it was a managed gold standard where they would hoard gold and things like that. And most economic historians would say that those manipulations are really what led to the Great Depression, because the Fed had just been created. It didn't know what it was doing. It did all the wrong things, and it allowed the country to fall into a depression.
Dick, this has been a wonderful discussion. If listeners want to find you online and learn more about your research, where would you point them?
It's just easy to find me. It's just Richard Langlois, Langlois. Google me, and my webpage at UConn will come up.
Fantastic. We will include that link and a link to the book in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining. This was a lot of fun after reading your book to speak with you about it.
Great. Well, I very much enjoyed it. Thank you.